I hope that we learn the lesson that testing things is easier if it's done more frequently on smaller number of changes. Hopefully, we learn that lesson, right?
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 252, How to Upgrade Kubernetes. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darin and Viktor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darin reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Viktor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darin Pope and Viktor Farsic. So in a recent DevOps Paradox Live, which happens on Fridays when we're around, we were talking about the latest upgrade for AWS EKS to 129. Nothing surprising about that, right?
Nothing surprising. Except, I guess you're referring to the policy that now they support older versions, right?
Correct. They now have extended support that you can get support for a version for up to a year after its official ending date. And right now, as we're recording this, there are 7 versions being supported. 7. That's quickly going to be ramping down to about 3 by the end of 2024.
So 3 will be will be covered by the standard support, right?
3, correct. More or less. I mean, it depends on the exact day you're landing on. And then there will be 1 that's extended support. Now, here's the question. When we sign up to use Kubernetes, are we really thinking about having to keep it upgraded as well? I mean, the project itself releases about 3 times a year. It used to be 4, and they backed it down to 3. Are you willing to take every 4 months having to upgrade Kubernetes?
That's the question that somebody should answer before adopting Kubernetes, right? Because that's like with any software or any service, assuming that you're familiar with it, you subscribe, whether you want it or not, to certain way of working, right? And that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's something that you are in a way accepting, right? It's almost like I feel that we should have a checkbox, you know, when using Kubernetes or installing it even ourselves. Kind of, are you willing to accept? Do you accept that this thing will be updated every 3 months, every 4 months actually, right? And that you will have to be more precise, that every 4 months you will have a new release, and that only 3 or 4, I'm not sure what's the official Kubernetes supported cycle, but only a relatively small number of those will be supported, and that you will have to upgrade every 4 months. It should be kind of a contract, right? Now you can say, hey, it's not every 4 months, but it is every 4 months, because you need to upgrade to the next minor version, right? So yes, you can wait for a year, but then you need to fast track those 3 releases that you're behind.
I think, well, it's interesting you brought up the minor version. So right now, the current GA version is 1.29. We are not even talking about the patch versions. But does that matter? Because it could, right?
Yes. I mean, those are some of the reasons why, apart from logistical reasons, kind of simply we cannot do it in a day, why typically cloud providers do not consider giving you the latest, right? They typically wait. I mean, they might release the latest and say this is alpha from our perspective, but they would typically wait until a few patches are released, you know, until other guinea pigs discover what's wrong with it, right?
So let's go back to the part here about miners. If we are currently on 127 and I need to get to 129, I'll just go straight from 127 to 129, no problem.
Good luck with that. Good luck with that, right? Because Kubernetes provides a certain guarantees, certain mechanisms that upgrading from one minor version to the next minor version is going to work. Probably, likely, right? That's what's tested. Right? Nobody tests upgrading from 120 to 129. Nobody, right? You would be basically on your own. What we do know is that people tried out, people tested, and they confirmed that most likely going to the next minor version works. Otherwise, it would be a nightmare for maintainers of the project to include in their verifications and validations all the permutations of all the versions that were released so far. That's just silly, right? And it's also better for you, right? So it's not only that others, those maintaining the project, are having easier time, but for you, it's safer to do it like that. Now, nothing prevents you from jumping 3 versions in a day, one after another, but you should go to the next minor version, whatever that is.
So all I have to do is upgrade my control plane, right? I don't have to worry about my worker nodes at all.
I mean, you're not forced to worry. You should, but it's not mandatory.
But I don't have time to do all that all at the same time. I mean, come on. I mean, you're saying I could do it all in one day, so I'll just do it all in one day. But in order to do that, I have to do just the control plane.
The time is not an issue there, right? Especially if you're using managed Kubernetes service, right? Which, to begin with, some providers will not even allow you to jump more than one version at a time, right? But time-wise, that's not really a problem. You can say, okay, I'm going to upgrade from 123 to 124 and then immediately upgrade to 125 and then to 126. Time is not an issue. I mean, you can easily upgrade within a day, unless we're talking about really, really big clusters. Technically, you can upgrade, you can go through 3-4 versions in a day easily, right? It's rolling upgrades. It upgrades one node and then another and then another and then another. So time is not really a problem there. The problem is, how do you confirm that it works? Right? So that might be your time question, right? Are you going to, if you're jumping 3 versions, are you going to test it 3 times or to test it once because you skipped 2 of those, right?
Well, I would probably just go ahead and test it on the first one and ignore the other 2 because I'm assuming the first one was fine.
Go ahead. Let me know how it went. I mean, to be honest, I'm not hearing many, if any, complaints about upgrades of Kubernetes anymore, right? Because there are a couple of reasons for that. First, they're pretty much backwards compatible. And when I say Kubernetes, actually, let me backtrack for a second, right? When we talk about Kubernetes and upgrading Kubernetes, we are not talking necessarily about upgrading versions of all the workloads that are running in Kubernetes, right? And many of the things are removed from Kubernetes. So you're mostly, when you upgrade, you're upgrading the engine and you're upgrading some potentially core resources like those that are baked into Kubernetes, like deployment service, replica set, ingress. And many of those are going out or are already out. CNI is not inside Kubernetes. You need to install it yourself unless you use a managed service that will give it to you, and quite a few others, right? So you're really upgrading the engine. You're not upgrading the specification, the API of many of the things that you're normally using, right? So you can upgrade 7 versions of Kubernetes and still have the same version of Cilium CNI, right? Assuming that it's compatible with the old version of CNI is compatible with the new version of Kubernetes.
Well, I think you just touched on a point there. Just because things are backwards compatible does not mean that they are forwards compatible.
I mean, exactly. And I mean, they are within the next version.
Maybe.
But so look at it from this perspective, right? I often hear companies complaining how... Actually, I hear two complaints. I hear more than two, but I'm going to stick with two for now, right? We cannot upgrade things, whatever those things are. Doesn't matter whether it's Kubernetes or no, frequently, right? It's just too much work. And the second complaint is that we have too many vulnerabilities. We need to remove them, right? To fix them. And those two complaints do not go well with each other. Because among other things, when you upgrade to a new version of something, you're reducing the vulnerabilities that are exposed simply because that newer version has security fixes as well, right? People discovered vulnerabilities and fixed them.
Well, that's true most of the time. But how many more did they just introduce in this new version?
Let me put it this way. Let's make a bet. Pick anything you want. Alpine, let's say operating system, Alpine, Ubuntu, anything you want, right? And what you said is true. But my bet is that whatever you pick, you can pick anything you want. Older version has more vulnerabilities than the newer one. And very likely, the new vulnerabilities discovered in a new one are not only... Some of them are because they were introduced in the newer version of something, but many of them were simply discovered at that time. And they exist in your previous version as well. But I'm willing to take that bet for anything you want. Let's say Ubuntu. Take two versions, I guarantee that the older one has more vulnerabilities.
I'll take that bet because I don't know that I agree with that.
Okay.
It may have more vulnerabilities. Those other vulnerabilities may have been there all along. But I can guarantee that more vulnerabilities are being added in because of the churn of the developers that are creating it. Maybe
for some projects. But there are... So let's put it this way. Let's say that I limit my conversation to CNCF right now, right? And this probably applies to other foundations. Among other things, for projects to graduate, they need to up their game when security is concerned, right? And that means that later on, a project will be more serious probably about security than it was before. And that's not only for CNCF. You can see that in commercial or projects that have commercial offering on top, right? Projects, serious projects, especially those, and that's majority, that have a commercial interest in it, have actually a strong incentive to reduce vulnerabilities and be more serious about security simply because their business depends on it.
You realize I'm not being this big of a jerk on purpose, right?
I know.
I'm trying to play a role here.
Play a role. That's good.
Okay, let's assume that we're able to upgrade from one minor version to another. And all of that went okay. Anything that was added into that cluster, managed it, appears to be okay. I'm taking us back to our testing point that we were making earlier. It would be great if all we ever had to do was just install Kubernetes and upgrade Kubernetes. But for some reason, we have applications being deployed into Kubernetes for whatever reason, I don't know. That's a joke. Just because you've upgraded doesn't mean you're done. You have to test.
Exactly. The process in case of Kubernetes, and the same applies to something else, right? Create a new Kubernetes cluster that is the same as the one you're currently running. Put representative workloads into that cluster. Not the same scale. I'm not talking about hundreds of nodes and things like that, but workloads that are representative of the different things that you expect Kubernetes to do. upgrade, test, confirm that it works. I'm talking TDD now. Upgrade, test again, see the same results, go for production. And that's true for whatever you're doing, right? If you're not talking about Kubernetes, but go back to VMs, right? And you need to upgrade Ubuntu or whatever you're using, you're going to do the same, right? No. You should.
No, I'm not.
You should. Not you. I'm changing my words. I'm not saying anymore, you will do the same. You should do the same.
I agree that you should do the same, but I don't have the budget to spin up a new cluster even for a short term because that's not in my budget for this year.
Okay, but you will be, okay, forget about Kubernetes, right? You will be testing your applications, right?
Yes.
Okay. Next test cycle, whenever it comes, whatever it is, assuming that you're doing it more than once a year, use it on newer versions of things. Do it on newer version of... So do not only deploy newer version of your application, but of everything else. Or something at least. So use the testing cycle, right?
Yeah, but that's too much stuff going in at once. I can't do that.
Well, are you religious?
If I have to be, yes.
That helps, because then you can pray to the deity of your choice. That's your only option left.
This is the key part that we're trying to bring home here. If you're going for Big Bang, that's great. Get ready for a 2-week outage if everything goes well.
I think that the word you just said, Big Bang, is the key there. I hope that we learned the lesson. Again, now I'm going out to Kubernetes, nothing to do with Kubernetes, right? That testing things is easier if it's done more frequently on smaller number of changes. Hopefully, we learn that lesson, right? And hopefully, we learn that having releases of what we do every 2 years or once a year is actually riskier than doing it more frequently, whatever more frequently means, right? I hope that we learned that lesson. And if we did, the same applies to everything else. The reasons are the same, right? The reasons why it's better to jump from 128 to 129, that it's safer, is because the alternative of jumping from 110 to 129 is going to blow things up for sure. And you're going to be faced with the extremely much bigger number of issues that you need to solve at a single time, at a single moment, right? And you will not be able to identify what those issues are, right? Because if I jump from 128 to 129 of Kubernetes, or same thing with if I jump on a new release of my application that contains something that I've been developing within last 2 weeks, and I'm being generous now, I know that more or less the scope of what is wrong is within those 2 weeks. I can find it. If I try to release new version of my application that's been in development for, I don't know, 1 year, 2 years, I don't know how people even did that in the past. How did they identify, okay, so of those thousands and thousands of hours and God of work that we invested into it, this is what is failing. And it's probably not going to be one thing. It's going to be a lot of things. It's very hard to identify a problem that could be caused by something you did a year ago.
I've heard of these unicorns that weekly replace all of their worker nodes. Like they just blow them all away. Everything gets replaced every week. Because if they've either got a new AMI, if they're in AWS, right, they have a new base image. And it gets reset every week. That seems extreme to me, but it also, going back to what you were saying, seems a lot safer. But only if it's automated. If people aren't willing to do that level of work, So those are unicorns, in my opinion, right? The replacing everything every week. And they aren't willing to upgrade more than once every year, which is legitimate. It's going to be hard, but it's legitimate for a short window of time. Where should they fall in between? What do you think the sweet spot is?
I'm not sure that I would go to that extreme, like destroy everything weekly. Or maybe I would, right? Because I don't think that people are destroying their clusters and servers weekly because that's great by itself. I feel that they're doing it because it's a great exercise, right? I can recreate my whole system and I can prove that, right? And the only way I can recreate the system is through heavy automation, right? And if you get to that spot, then actually once a week or a day or a month doesn't matter anymore, right? Because if you prove that you can do something, and that something is done without your direct involvement or without much direct involvement, then, hey, any frequency is okay. There is not, this is too frequent, unless we're talking every minute, right? So why not? Right now, I'm not saying that all companies should invest in being able to do that because it's expensive. It's not expensive doing it, right? It's expensive getting to the point where you can do it. For the majority of us, I think that simply upgrading your clusters to a newer version is more than enough, right? Because that's a distraction as well. I want to make that clear, right? When we talk about upgrading Kubernetes, in vast majority of cases, we're not talking about, hey, this node, doesn't matter whether it's a worker node or a control plane node, this node will be running a newer version of Kubernetes or whatever else. That's not what we're talking about. Upgrades in Kubernetes are destructive always, or in most cases, right? So if you upgrade, let's say you're following the 4-month cycle of Kubernetes. That's how frequently you're destroying everything. Because the upgrade is destruction. It's just rolling destruction, right? Destroy this node, create a new one, join it to the cluster, repeat, 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 repeat.
So answer this. Would it be sane for me in my production environments to run one version behind? So let's take AWS, for example, but this could easily be Azure or GCP. Mm-hmm. The current GA version they're shipping right now, or the most recent version, is 129.
Okay.
So for me, should I keep prod at 128, but then my staging cluster, assuming I have a staging cluster, goes to 129? Or, let me phrase it a little bit differently. Should I be 2 versions behind in prod? My staging cluster stays 1 version behind, and then okay, let's start testing out the new thing in the 3rd cluster that's really transient. What do you think is a better way of doing things?
I wouldn't keep staging 1 version behind, right? Because assuming that your frequency of deploying new releases is not every 4 months, right? Unless we're talking about preparation for those, for the next iteration, I wouldn't do it, because what I really want to do in staging is test the situation that will be in production afterwards, right? So if I'm running production 128, and my staging should be 128 as well.
So how would I work in 129?
I think it's reasonable to be 1 version behind the released Kubernetes version, which is very often cloud providers are not going to give you the latest the moment it's released anyways. So be 1 behind, be 2 behind, it's okay, right? I don't think that there is a compelling reason to be on the bleeding edge of Kubernetes, kind of be always on the latest. 1 behind, 2 behind is fine, right? It's not receiving any more so many changes, and it's coming every 4 months. So as long as you're within 2 versions behind, you're fine. Whatever the choice is, keep to it. Don't be on that version forever. Just be always 1 behind or 2 behind, and you'll be fine. As long as you follow that pace. So if right now we're using the latest is 129, I'm not saying you should be on 127 and stay on 127. I'm saying you should be, let's say, 2 versions behind or 1 version behind whatever the current one is, and then you're fine. And keep your all environments in that version, unless there is a very, very good reason not to do so, right? Going back to your question, yes, staging, keep it to the same as production, unless you're planning to upgrade the production in a relatively short period of time. Then you want to change test that upgrade, just as you're testing upgrades of your applications.
So what do you think? How are you managing your own Kubernetes clusters? Go over to the Slack workspace, go down to the podcast channel, and leave some comments. We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.